There are some movies that mark you forever. The ones that you discover at a formative point in your life, and which leave a permanent mark on you. Throughout the years, you rewatch them again and again, with every time the feeling that you are rediscovering some primordial truth about the human condition. For some, it might be because they relate deeply to a character. For others, it is for the scent of nostalgia that permeates each scene, a Madeleine de Proust that brings them back to better days. While I appreciate movies that trigger my melancholia, I also tend to be attracted towards flicks that push me to action, those overloaded with a primal passion that you just can't sit still to watch, filled with epic battles that have you pacing the room, your chest filled with the desire to imitate them and become stronger. While many action movies excel when it comes to adrenaline, sword and sandal stories tend to take the palm when it comes to inspiration. And out of the genre, there is one that many believe to be the definite king, a testosterone booster for the ages, that has cemented itself in most minds as the pinnacle of masculine energy. It isn't just the fight scenes. There is something special about this movie that transcends the blood and gore formula and explains why men are so obsessed with 300. The first scene is an immediate civilizational shock, a practice that our modern hearts would deem barbaric. The inspection of babies at birth to detect any defects, which would then lead to the infant getting discarded. This theatrical display of natural selection is there to remind us that there were times in history when weakness was systematically punished, modern egalitarianism not having yet made its way into the common consciousness. In Sparta, life is a test from birth, and the society depicted in 300 does everything in its power to allow that natural law to perpetuate, to the point of centering its education system around survival of the fittest. They named it the Agogi, a state-sponsored training regimen that saw every male child removed from their families at the age of 7 and thrown to the wolves in order to turn them into strong and moral Spartan citizens. Food was minimal, and discomfort the norm. And while the movie greatly exaggerates how barbaric the practice was, it serves as a reminder of the important rites of passages that used to guide young men on the path to adulthood. Compared to the education systems of most Western countries that completely neglect physical education and regard standards with an ever so disapproving eye, this rigorous method appears nothing short of fascist. I've often seen critics on YouTube bemoaning the movie's enamorment with authoritarianism, some going as far as comparing it to Nazi propaganda. Anachronism aside, it is true that the movie's depiction of civic duties is entirely opposed to democratic sentiments. It would be unthinkable for us to force someone, especially a child, to endure pain for the benefit of the nation. But maybe that's why men like this movie so much. To be able to enjoy freedom, one also has to deal with responsibilities, something that modern sensibility tends to reject. But since the man who seeks rights without duties will have neither, 300 is a good reminder of the necessary sacrifices that countries have to make to sustain their hegemony. An historical reality that this warless generation needs to remember. To keep the walls of the city strong, they have to be manned by strong soldiers, and strength can only be built through struggle. Pain is an inescapable part of life. You either accept it willingly or become its victim. Such is the lesson that ancient Sparta teaches us, symbolized by cruel but efficient training methods. A visible outcome of these draconian measures is represented by the visible fitness of Spartan citizens, each boasting slim but powerful physiques that put to shame the potato-shaped frame of your average 21st century human. This desire to represent human excellence through aesthetics is a key theme of the movie, and goes beyond just six-packs and biceps. It also aligns with the Hellenic interpretation of the body-spirit continuum, which insists on the importance of developing both the muscles and the brains. Greek philosophers such as Xenophon and Aristotle believed that no man could call himself complete without working daily on both, a mindset far removed from the current dualistic stance that as humans treat their bodies as nothing more than a vessel for their consciousness. Spartan men all have visible abdominals, along with sculpted arms and chests to go with athletic legs and yoked upper backs. As for the women, they all showcase thin waists and ample bosoms, along with flat stomachs, a painful reminder of what humanity used to have before it surrendered itself to comfort. The pursuit of struggle is a key aspect of masculinity, an ideal embodied by the figure of the Spartan soldier, for whom dying in battle for the glory of Sparta is the highest honor there is. But it isn't just military members who showcase strong masculine values. The men of Sparta all have an air of confidence about them, and the same goes for the women. In a warrior culture, weakness isn't tolerated in either sex. As such, every citizen pushes to become the best they can be, and they make sure their neighbor does as well, keeping their civilization on a constant upward trajectory. Mothers can be seen observing their husbands training their children with a smile on their face, knowing that every drop of sweat shed on that day will be blood spared in the future. These father and son wrestling sessions also serve as bonding time, an essential aspect of masculinity that has but disappeared in modern society, but would do well to make a comeback, for it could constitute the cure to many young men's problems. Not only does it instill discipline from a young age, but it also makes the path to masculinity that much easier to navigate, by providing the child with a model to follow, both in physique and mindset. Strong fathers raise strong men. Such is the Spartan spirit. This ideal, when shared by the greater number, gives birth to strong civilizations. Weakness is therefore not just a flaw, but an evil to vanquish to protect society from moral and social degeneration. The movie takes this idea a step further, by attributing moral qualities to characters based on their physical appearance, an ancient practice known as physiognomy. The Ephors, whose role is to interpret the will of the gods, are depicted as grotesquely deformed, an appearance that mirrors their lecherous and vile nature. Ephialtes, the character that would go on to betray the Spartans, is also a hunchback, a handicap rendering him incapable of fighting properly. This flaw isn't what makes him despicable. Rather, it's what the physical limitations did to his character that leads to his ignoble nature. The rejections he suffered poisoned his mind and filled it with a resentment that would eventually lead to him attempting to destroy what he couldn't be a part of. It isn't then that ugly people are untrustworthy by default, but that the evil thoughts caused by their condition have the tendency to debase their soul, making them amoral creatures. On the other hand, virtuous characters are depicted as healthy and strong, and hierarchies between humans presented as not only natural, but also desirable within society. In Sparta, it is the aristocracy that rules and takes decisions. with at its head the king, whose power is limited by the Council of Elders. Democracy is rejected, along with the idea that political responsibility should be distributed equally. Only those who have proven their worth get to wade in, and the rest follow. This system has its flaws, and the slow degeneration of political elites is in full display with the character of Theron, who betrays Sparta by accepting Persian gold. He is depicted as scheming and fox-like, in complete opposition with Leonidas, who is the archetype of the Solar King, represented by the figure of the lion. His only concern is for his people and land, which also explains why he gets backstabbed so often. There is so little room in his heart for villainy that he cannot fathom its existence in others. In both its embrace of physiognomy and classical aristocratic values, the movie takes a clear stance against materialistic ethics by underlining the importance of essence over existence and virtue over wealth. It is no wonder then why some modern men would resent this message and feel called out by it. They see themselves in characters like Theron or Ephialtes, and perceive Leonidas as a repressive force. In spite of this resentment, the accusations of fascism are not entirely unfounded. After all, 300 does depict the war efforts of a military dictatorship to repel invaders. The key is to understand the reason for the fighting and the nature of the opponent. First off, Leonidas is not the instigator of these battles. Faced with a Persian envoy who promised him death and destruction if he refused to pay tribute, he decided that violence was the only way to prevent his people from getting enslaved by a foreign power. At no point does he leave the confines of his country to wage war. He simply stands his ground and prevents invading forces from destroying his land. While this does constitute nationalism, one would have a tough time arguing that the Spartans are the oppressors in this scenario. It is the Persian Empire and its imperialistic views that constitutes the true enemy of freedom. By annihilating indigenous identities and gathering them all under one flag, Xerxes' attempt at syncretism establishes him as the one true tyrant of the story, in opposition with Leonidas, who fights for the liberty of every Greek nation. While Leonidas holds decisional power, he always heeds the advice of his men, and only goes against the Senate's decision if he believes it to be for the benefit of his people. He marches to battle with his soldiers as an equal, and is entirely willing and even eager to die by their sides. He exists entirely to serve, making him both a slave and a king, which is the true nature of every enlightened leader. These traits echo the Spartan ethos. Every man is responsible for his words and actions, making sense of duty the cornerstone of their society. Xerxes, on the other hand, is the sole decision taker, and yet he never carries any of them out himself. Worse, when things go wrong, the responsibility is put on whoever failed to properly follow his orders, and anyone who disappoints him ends up headless. He gets all the glory, but carries none of the burden. Like a petulant child masquerading as a god, he is unfit to be a leader. This never becomes more evident than when the two warlords meet. Despite the immense gap in power and wealth, the Persian ruler appears impotent, almost distraught by the Spartan's stoic demeanor and complete lack of fear. Xerxes, through his mannerisms, is portrayed as effeminate and vain, with Leonidas appearing eminently masculine in their interaction. This is even visible in the difference between their garments. while the Spartan king sports the same military attire as his men and is undistinguishable from them. Xerxes' jewelry makes him stand out from the rest of his army. One wears his value on his sleeve, the other around his neck. He also insists on having soldiers carry him around on a gigantic golden throne, metaphorically symbolizing that he is above the act of walking. This portrait of otherworldliness is completed by his extraordinary height, adding an additional distance between him and the men that fight for his cause, who are nothing to him but lowly pawns to move around for his enjoyment and benefit. His role is one of terror and greed. He is the human personification of tyranny, a man devoid of any higher virtue, whose existence centers entirely around his self. Xerxes is the face of an inhuman government that robs men of their free will and turns them into obedient sheep. This megalomania extends to the very nature of his troops. While you could expect armies coming from the four corners of the empire to showcase some level of individuality, their sense of belonging has been replaced by fear. In place of camaraderie or faith, there is only blind obedience, every warrior having been turned into slave fighters who follow Xerxes out of fear or obligation. They do not know why they fight, just that they have to obey orders. Despite their number, this lack of identity makes them weak, as all the hierarchical organization in the world is moot, if not based on a common trust and shared values. Spartans are the exact opposite. There might only be 300 of them, but each one is worth 100 Persians, because their spirit of cohesion is strong. This doesn't mean that they surrender to the collective. Rather, they willingly add up their strength to reach a common goal: the defense of a city that they hold dear. Unlike the Persians, who just rush into battle with no formation to speak of, Leonidas' soldiers follow a minutely crafted fighting plan. Their phalanx is a perfectly oiled mechanism, each of its members moving and fighting as one, as if their sights were fixated on the same objective and their hearts beating to the same tune. This strategy would not work if their individual strength was low. It would also fail if their trust in one another wasn't indestructible. As a whole, their military tactics perfectly mirror the inner workings of a healthy society, while Xerxes' army displays all of the characteristics of a dysfunctional one. The first is homogeneous and high trust. The other, chaotic and ruthless, the result of a globalized supernation that ignores cultural differences and forces men to gather around dreams of conquest devoid of spirituality. And yet, both of these nations shed blood. But is violence an inherently immoral act? Is the sword that protects the innocent carrying the same sin as the one who maims it? Violence and authority have their place within organized society, and their use doesn't make a civilization inherently fascist or evil. Its application does. To protect the tribe from outside threats, the individuals that are part of it must face the lurking danger. This entails conflict and therefore violence. If they fail, the group might disappear, at which point inaction would actually constitute violence against those that most require protection. In our post-war world, this dilemma has apparently disappeared, as if the very idea of an enemy existing outside the border was just an antiquated fantasy, a story we tell children to make them behave. We have slowly forgotten the existence of chaos, relented on order, and taken down the walls that protected us. Spartans do not have that luxury. The foe they face is very real, and the treasure they seek to protect evident. It is the lives of the innocents within the city bounds. While the bulk of the movie focuses on the action, this underlying motive is always looming in the background, giving a sense to the bloodbath. 300 is not a movie about shirtless brutes engaging in mindless slaughter, nor is it a tale glorifying the discarding of handicapped children and destruction of foreign invaders. Rather, it reframes the cruelty of these acts in their context and challenges our modern minds to think with a Bronze Age mindset. If Leonidas turns down Ephialtes, it isn't to mock him, but because the success of the Spartan formation relies on the solidity of every single man. If one individuality falters, the collective fails. The symbolic behind that message is evident. For society to survive, it cannot tolerate any weak links, as these would threaten the integrity of the whole chain. Better than to remove them rather than letting their existence become a threat to the perennity of the group. Such is the callous reality of a pre-abundance wood. If anything, Leonidas committed a blunder by not killing Ephialtes when he had the chance. It is this great naivety that led to Xerxes discovering the hidden path through the hunchback's eventual betrayal. Those that cannot bring value to life would be better off dead, or else their ignominy might rub off on us. It sounds horrible until you consider that it is this sacrifice that allows for the survival of women and children. If the formation falls, the walls do as well, and the city becomes defenseless. When the men are on the battlefield, they are cruelly aware of what is on the line. Not just their lives, that counts for nothing, but the lives of the people that they shield. In martial terms, we call it duty, but it has another name: love. For the hand that wields the sword is never more savage than when it moves to protect what the heart holds dear. As exhilarated by battle as they seem, there always exist within warriors testimonies of this fondness. Leonidas' last words, for example, weren't for his gods, but for his queen. Spartan women also live with that pain, as they get to watch their husband leave home and potentially never return. While the movie does technically relegate them to the role of housewives and childbearers, it would be forced to say that 300 has no strong female characters. Gorgo is the main driver of the entire political subplot that gives meaning to the battle scenes, with her devotion to Sparta so strong that she would go as far as to offer her body in order to save the 300. Mirroring the sometimes naive virtue of her husband, she also gets betrayed, but her actions are ultimately responsible for the city's survival. Some would say that this is a minor part, but what exactly was she supposed to do instead? Join Leonidas on the battlefield and fight with her sandals? Had the movie gone down that route, it would have been a betrayal of what constitutes a strong female character. Women are not born to be warriors, and Hollywood's insistence on shoehorning them in that role is an insult to the feminine essence. Their power is not loud and boisterous, but subtle and quiet. It is a behind-the-scene act that takes place far away from the battlefield, exactly in the fashion depicted by Gorgo's actions. 300 is an accurate representation of how masculine and feminine forces complete each other to create a balanced society, sometimes in a caricatural way, but always in a fashion much more connected to reality than our progressive views on equality, which would insist on women joining the battle for parity's sake. As decried as patriarchies are these days, they got some things right. For example, the assignment of rigid gender roles that best align with the biology and inclinations of both men and women. Keeping the weaker sex far away from the bloodshed isn't sexist, it's smart. Just like you wouldn't leave a precious sculpture in the middle of a stampede. Likewise, hiding your woke hammer under the bed to preserve it from damage makes little sense. And so the men fight, and the women nurture. Naturally, it also results in the latter having no political power in society, but it doesn't mean that women have no voice to the chapter, only that they can't exercise it in name. We saw that with Gorgo, whose influence on Leonidas and the Senate effectively makes her second in command. But it doesn't take a queenship for a woman to be powerful. At the core of every group of humans is the mother, whose womb creates life and gives birth to civilizations. Spartan women are aware of their status as original creators, and take pride in being the only ones able to give birth to Spartan men, who then go on to protect them by becoming strong Spartan soldiers. The patriarchy imbues the life of both sexes with meaning and purpose. The Persians also have a patriarchal society, but one that is depicted as degenerate and rabid. This is due to an absence of femininity, which has always served as a balancing force to regulate aggressivity. Without it, men lose their humanity and turn back into beasts. The feminine essence forever pushes towards more acceptance, temperance, and love. When it is absent, civilizations regress into barbarism. What makes Sparta great is not only the strength of its warriors, but also the goodness of its women. One is nothing without the other. While Leonidas' soldiers are depicted as upstanding and valorous, Xerxes' forces are painted as vile and monstrous, not hesitating to engage in dishonorable practices to obtain victory. That is what awaits men if civilization falls. Everything is done to make the viewer understand that this isn't just the battle of two armies, but rather the eternal clash of good versus evil, a dichotomy best represented by the immortals, who are as close to demons as humans can get. Their ugliness echoes the darkness in their hearts. If other members of the Persian army displayed goofy or otherwise deformed physiognomies, these warriors are cruelty personified. They are literally described as beasts in the shape of men, tormentors of the innocent, and are said to be immortal. Once again, the exact opposite of the Spartans, for whom the worst insult imaginable is, "May you live forever." They are the chaos that threatens the light, the very reason why Leonidas refused to surrender to Xerxes, because it would have been opening his doors to their kind. His aversion towards submission isn't born from misplaced masculine ego or a taste for blood, but rather a keen understanding of the real nature of this word. He who refuses to take up the blade will see it used against his loved ones. Civis pacem, parabellum, a morality far removed from our modern reality, but one that we must heed, for the cognitive dissonance it triggers forces us to reevaluate what we always held as right. Suddenly, modernity appears distinctly one-dimensional. Are we really more civilized because we forego violence? Or did we just lose on an integral part of the human experience? Just like we slowly gave up on our bodies as comfort invaded our lives, it appears that peace has also lured us into a false sense of security. What will happen then when danger comes knocking? The sudden resurgence of chaos into the lives of humans is an inevitable truth. Our ancestors were aware of it, and it is high time we remembered as well. With that in mind, the movie's obsession with bloody battle scenes explains itself. The goal is to excite the male power fantasy within men in an effort to awaken the warrior in them. In that sense, it wouldn't be wrong to call 300 masculine propaganda. The hyper-focus on muscularity and strength, allied with the glorification of violence, is the perfect cocktail to trigger the dormant modern man. Subconsciously, the movie teaches us to side with the Spartans by painting them as morally superior and making the Persians out to be cowardly beasts. As such, we are also very likely to espouse our traditional values, namely the pursuit of individual freedom and rejection of any system that aims to control it.
This is Sparta!
Xerxes, the face of oppressive authority, would like you to kneel. Leonidas only asks that you stand. That is the message of the movie. Through the retelling of an historical event, Zack Snyder challenges contemporary values by reframing violence within a context where it isn't only justified, but also necessary. The Spartans who use it are brave, confident, exalted, everything that the modern man is not. Just like sculptures of old heroes, these examples reflect on the viewer, forcing a painful introspection. There is a reason why people are tearing down statues nowadays, because they cannot stand the comparison. They hide themselves behind morality, pretending to get rid of cruel idols, but the truth is elsewhere. It is the gaze of their ancestors they cannot stand, the constant reminder that they are not living up to their potential. 300, through its action scenes, forces you to bear witness not only of what men used to be, but what they could become again. The Spartans sacrificed sons, said forever goodbyes to their wives, and faced death with a smile. And you can't even get off the couch to go train? Pathetic. I understand why some men resist this movie. Beyond the unflattering comparison, there is also a definite presence of reactionary imagery, sometimes in quite the heavy-handed fashion. But there are also many themes that everyone can get behind, like the open criticism of corrupt politicians, or the fight against barbarism and tyranny led by the Spartans. And while Sparta was unquestionably an aristocratic and military dictatorship, two aspects that the story fully embraces, it must be remembered that it is these authoritarian systems that eventually gave birth to democracy. If you get to enjoy personal freedoms, it is thanks to the brave warriors of ancient Greece. You have the privilege of being an equality-loving freethinker because they paved the way for peace and prosperity. See then that you do not speak ill of their deeds. For some to live in heaven, others have to die in hell, and Satan cares not for table manners. When times get hard, and they will, you might find yourself in their bloodied shoes. Remember us. Remember why we died. This is what is asked of us. You don't have to be white or European to appreciate the legacy of the 300. Regardless of who you are, you have ancestors who have fought and died, hoping to create a better life for you. It is said that Spartans were descendants of Hercules himself. That might be a myth, but one thing is certain: we descend from the Spartans. If you are a man, this movie tells your story. Some people say there's something wrong with men who like 300. I say there's something wrong with them. If masculinity had a theme song, this would be its anthem.
This day, we rescue a world from mysticism and tyranny, and usher in a future brighter than anything we can imagine. Give thanks, man! To Leonidas and the brave 300! To victory!